Yeah, hey, I'm Grant Dunnavan. I'm an international relations major. I am from Orlando, Florida, and I'm a senior. My internship was the summer after my sophomore year. It was with the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission. So that's the House of Representatives Human Rights Commission dealing with international human rights affairs and specifically violations. It's bipartisan, so there's a Republican co-chair and a Democratic co-chair, and it is a commission instead of a committee, so it doesn't have legislative power, but it has oversight power for hearings, briefings, and giving advice to legislators about what to do in terms of gross human rights violations. Sure, so daily life during my internship, um, well, I lived pretty far, so I'm going to speak specifically from the DC context because that's where this internship was. But I lived about 40 minutes away, so if you're planning on interning in DC, understand that you probably are going to have a decent commute. The metro is fun to learn, but give yourself time. So it was generally about a 40 to 45 minute commute, and then I worked from about 9 to 6 because we like to stay a little bit later than some of the other offices. Um, I worked for the top Republican staffer for the Republican co-chair. So that meant my boss was the co-chair's foreign policy advisor. So my daily life, there were a few different things I did. One of the main things I was tasked with was organizing congressional hearings having to do with human rights violations. So I put together a few of those in conjunction with the Democratic co-chair's staffer. I helped edit and review some legislation. I attended meetings in the stead of my boss, sometimes with dignitaries, took notes, didn't really speak much because everybody was way more qualified than me in those. And I also did just general work on the website for the Lantos Human Rights Commission, updating website issues, writing briefings, hearings after, writing the transcripts of the briefings and hearings afterwards. And then occasionally, because I was working inside of, but not for the actual district office of the congressman, occasionally I would work with his interns on some other things too. They were more, typical congressional office things, such as drafting correspondence with constituents and things of that nature. I heard about it in a way that many people get internships in DC. It was word of mouth. And so I'll explain how that happened and then I'll give you a piece of advice. So I had a family friend who had previously worked with the foreign policy staffer for the congressman. And upon hearing that I was looking for internships in that regard, he connected with me and then sent my resume to the guy who ended up being my boss. So that sounds kind of intimidating because that's a hard thing to just know someone. And so I'll say on one hand, yes, DC is kind of a weird place where to kind of get to know people, you already have to know people, so it can kind of be this difficult cycle. But at the same time, there were lots of forums online. You can use LinkedIn. There are a lot of willing people who have been helped, and the only reason why they're in the position they are in is because someone reached out to them when they weren't, really worth the time per se. And so always be confident to ask for help from people because that's what happened with me, and that's why I got the internship. Yeah, something I wish I knew before I started. A combination of two things. They're kind of dependent on each other. First, have humility. Second, be confident. And when I say that, I mean you're not expected to know things when you're an intern, especially if they hire you knowing it's your first internship. You're going to feel a lot of pressure to do things right. And in fact, you're going to think that your competency has to do with how well you can do your job without asking questions. When in reality, that's just not the way it goes. You can only become competent after you ask questions, and you only ask questions when you humble yourself, but are confident enough to do so. So don't expect that you're going to know how to do everything because they don't expect that you're going to know how to do everything. Ask questions because it's a lot better to ask questions ahead of time and do things right than to just try to become, the next the big intern who can do everything him or herself, and then you actually mess up. So luckily that was the lesson I learned pretty soon on, and it wasn't something I had to experience in a negative way. But never be afraid to ask questions and be humble. But also, you were hired, so be confident because they think that you can do the job that you've been hired for. I'm going to actually answer this kind of in a negative way, but with a positive kind of spin. So the internship I'm specifically discussing, I didn't really connect with anybody as well as I'd like to. Now, I also had a second DC internship where I realized that the lack of the connections that I had was something that I wished I'd worked on. So, whereas in the first internship that I'm discussing, really nobody left that great of an impact because I didn't take the time to get to know them. During my second internship, I really took time to get to know the people that I was working with. A lot of my friends who were the interns are people that I still keep in contact with. So, kind of a piece of advice in terms of what I wish I had done in terms of the people that I got to know. Impress your bosses, work hard, but connect and become friends with your interns. Because if you're trying to go to DC, which is a pretty small city, those are the people you're going to be rising through the ranks with. Even if they're not in your class, in the same few years, you're all going to be there. So I think something I'm grateful for the second time around was that I had a lot of people who made an experience or made an impact on me. And I still communicate with them. I text with them almost every day. So really the lack of having a good connection my first internship is what inspired me to do better the second time. And I think if you really do that, it will be a really, really helpful. It'll be helpful both in the fact that you'll have fun and you'll have connections afterwards. Yeah, my internship experience really impacted my thoughts for my future career. So before I had got the internship in DC, I wasn't sure if I was more interested in politics or foreign policy. And it just so happened that this internship was kind of a beautiful mix of both. It was a foreign policy internship, so working for a Human Rights Commission, but working for a Republican co-chair, so inherently political, because I was in Congress, I was in one of the House office buildings, and everything was, everything's politicized. So I think I got lucky in terms of I had an internship that kind of had a good mix of both, which told me that actually I'd be fine with doing either. So after school, I'm interested in either politics or foreign policy. For me, particularly more as politics as a conduit to get into the foreign policy realm. So something I would recommend and kind of commend to everybody who's thinking about internships, apply to a lot, but don't be stingy, because oftentimes it's the things that you learn what you don't want to do that are actually as beneficial as what you do want to do. So luckily for me, both the things that were kind of tied into this internship were things that I'm interested in, but I have a lot of friends who did internships that they thought they wanted to do, and it turns out that they didn't want to do them in the long run. I was raised with the phrase in my household, early's on time is late, late's unacceptable. Now, of course, when you go through a internship, you'll become more comfortable with the people you're working with, so sometimes maybe it's okay to arrive late once you get to know them and establish a connection. But always be early. Don't be on time, because if you're planning to be on time, something can happen, and that makes you late. And you don't want to be late in the beginning of an internship. So I always planned to get there 10 minutes ahead of time. And my mom she always had this rule called time and a half. If you think something's going to take 30 minutes to get to, give yourself 45 minutes. If you think it's going to take an hour, give yourself an hour and a half. It's kind of annoying, but it's a lot better than showing up late, because it's embarrassing to be late. So always give yourself time, plan to be 5 or 10 minutes ahead of time, because really everybody likes it when you're there early. Especially in the political realm, when things are moving so quickly, people's time is very, very precious. That's something that people respect. And then secondly, be grateful. And I don't mean that in a condescending way, but really exude gratitude. Because again, especially if it's your first internship, to be honest, you probably don't have as much to offer as, a different staffer that they could have hired. But what they're doing is they're choosing to invest time in you, A, so that, they can have some labor, but B, so that hopefully if they care about you, they'll invest in you and make you a better person for it. So be grateful. Write a note at the end of your internship letting the people know that you're working for, that you were glad that you could work underneath them. Say thank you a lot, and let them know that you're truly honored and I guess humbled by the experience, because humility is a hard thing to come by, especially again in the political and foreign policy realm. Humility is not something that you see often, and I think as Christians, that's one of the main things that should make us stick out. They'll know that we're Christians by our love, but also by our humility. And so gratitude is a really good way to do that, because oftentimes people don't think about the extra step to show gratitude. So yeah, ultimately, be 5 minutes early, be grateful. It's pretty simple.